This is Crimea. What you are looking at is the peninsula as seen from orbit in 2021. Bright, warm, tethered to the mainland by roads and rails. Back then, it was the crown jewel of Vladimir Putin's territorial grabs, the single most valuable piece of land he had ever seized. Now look at the second image. That is Crimea today. 2026. Entire cities have faded to black. Whole regions are sitting without power and without water. The land corridors that once fed the peninsula have been severed. The sea routes are gone, and the Kerch Bridge is barely limping along. The territory Putin swallowed 12 years ago to prop up his own political survival is now, in real time, physically sinking into darkness for the entire world to watch. It has gotten so bad that Russia is now quietly asking the White House for help. So to understand just how desperate Moscow has become, we have to walk through three things. First, how Ukraine actually pulled off this blackout of Crimea. Second, why Crimeans are now paying the highest gasoline prices ever recorded anywhere on Earth. And third, how this is quietly strangling Russia's food supply. Because Russia may actually run out of things to eat, and that is one crisis Putin simply cannot afford. But before we dive into maps, missile strikes, and geopolitics, let us start with something more human. Let us talk about what ordinary Crimeans are living through right now, not as statistics, as people. A public appeal recently surfaced from a local resident. The message said, "Please explain why in this current emergency there is no support for the population, no generators, no fuel." People remember the blackouts, they remember the scheduled outages, and they remember the aid that used to come from the mainland. Today, many feel a complete and total loss of hope. Translation: Crimea is facing hardships it has never faced before. In the past, help arrived from Russia proper, but now Ukrainian long-range strikes have made that impossible. Drones and missiles have cut off the supply lines. Putin cannot reach his own people in Crimea, and it gets worse. Small businesses are collapsing one after another. Stores, coffee shops, salons, and bakeries are all hemorrhaging money. Many have already shut their doors for good. Meanwhile, taxes, rent, wages, and utility bills have not been paused. Incomes are disappearing, but the obligations remain. Thousands of families have lost the ability to cook food, charge phones, or give their children basic necessities. Tensions are spiking, theft reports are climbing. This is no longer a household inconvenience, this is a social rupture. Now let's talk about what Russians in Crimea have been dealing with over the past week. A second report from the peninsula says that many people in the northern regions have not had electricity or water for 7 full days. Normally in a situation like this, they would rely on generators, but they cannot even use generators right now. Because to run a generator, you need fuel. And fuel prices in Crimea? You would need to sell an arm and a leg just to afford it. That is, if you can even find fuel at all. There is an acute shortage across all of Russia, but especially in Crimea. People are waiting days, sometimes an entire week, just to reach the front of the line at a gas station so they can fill up their car. But what happens when you finally get to the front and there is no gas left? That is when tensions explode. We are seeing footage of people literally fighting each other at gas stations. And this is not just happening in Crimea. We are getting similar videos from Krasnodar Krai, from Rostov-on-Don, even from Moscow. There is a diesel shortage and a gasoline shortage spreading everywhere. Now let us talk about the prices in Crimea, because you are going to have a hard time believing these numbers. In my last video, some people commented that they were seeing prices online at only a couple of dollars per gallon in Russia. So this time we actually have pictures and videos from Russian gas stations showing the price in rubles, and we will translate those rubles into US dollars per gallon. Take a look at this first image. Here we have a Crimean resident who was lucky enough to find a working gas station. Watch as he reads the price. It says 330 rubles per liter. That translates to roughly $16 per gallon. That is more than 5 times what Americans are paying in the United States, and it is probably 3 to 4 times what Europeans are paying in Europe. And this is not an isolated example. Here is another gas station, probably from the same day or the same week, showing $17 per gallon. That is roughly a 400% price increase compared to just 6 weeks ago. Prices in Russia are rising faster than meme stocks. Then we have another station charging $19 per gallon. Now watch this next moment closely. When this Crimean man sees the price at the pump, he basically says he is better off just buying vodka instead. 380 rubles, he says. That is not a joke. I actually paid that money. By the way, they only accept cash. Cards do not work there. On one hand, it is good that I was able to fill up at all. On the other hand, gasoline now costs more than milk. It is more expensive than vodka. So basically, you could drive on alcohol instead. Unbelievable. According to this report, Crimeans are now paying the highest amount anyone in the world is paying for gasoline. That is how bad the situation has become. In some gas stations, prices are hitting as high as $22 per gallon. But that is expensive in dollar terms. To truly understand how bad this is, we have to consider what an average Crimean actually earns. Because $22 per gallon means something very different when your monthly income is only $600. In the United States, the average income is around $5,600 per month. That means a Crimean paying $17 per gallon is like an American paying $150 per gallon. That is the real purchasing power comparison, and that is why Russians get so angry when this metric is used against them. So the question now becomes, how did this actually happen? How does an oil superpower end up with record-breaking gas prices? Take a look at this map. This shows every Ukrainian strike on Russian energy and electricity infrastructure this year. Look at how concentrated those yellow dots are around Crimea. Since January 2026, Ukraine has hit 37 electrical substations, including oil depots and gas processing facilities. And these strikes do not even count all the logistical targets, the tankers, the trucks, and everything else Ukraine is hitting. This also does not take into account the reduced traffic across the Kerch Bridge because of previous Ukrainian attacks. All of this has a direct impact on civilian life in Crimea and on the military operations Russia is trying to support through that peninsula. Now, some of you may be asking the obvious question, why is Ukraine doing this, especially toward Crimean civilians? This is where it is important to remember that Ukraine did not start this war, and Ukraine was not the one who began attacking electricity infrastructure. That was Russia. Here is a map of Russian strikes against Ukrainian electricity infrastructure in 2024. Russia has been doing this every single year since the war began in 2022. They have systematically targeted Ukrainian power grids, substations. I am sure when Putin started this war, he did not think Ukraine would ever be able to build up the capability to hit back. But wars are unpredictable, and as the famous saying goes, the worst part about a 3-day special military operation is the 5th year. That is something Putin is learning in real time. Ukraine does not just have the capability to hit back at Russia, they are now hitting back harder than Russia used to hit them. In fact, President Zelensky himself announced roughly 2 weeks ago that the Ukrainian military intends to run a 40-day campaign targeting Russian logistics and anything else they can find. This is basically a warning to Putin to come to the negotiating table and agree to a peace deal that is realistic. Putin wants a peace deal where Ukraine simply surrenders, but in reality, Russia is the one on the back foot. You cannot expect the other side to surrender when you are the one retreating. Ukraine is gaining ground on the front lines, Ukraine is hitting Russia in the rear, and Russia basically has nothing that can stop Ukrainian drones. The Crimean operation is becoming truly brutal for Russia. Russian-occupied Crimea just officially announced that street lighting will be shut down across the peninsula because of the ongoing energy crisis. In the middle of summer, Russian streets are going dark, so I am guessing in a future video it will be hard to point out Crimea from satellite because there will be no lights left to see. Now, if you are a Russian citizen watching this, you are probably angry about the whole situation. But there is one single piece of good news. Unlike Vladimir Putin, who lives in luxury in Moscow or in his hidden palaces far from Ukrainian drones, Crimean politicians actually seem to be suffering alongside their own population. The Crimean Minister of Energy was recently filmed showing that her own home is running on the same failed infrastructure that everyone else has to deal with. Her home has no power, no gas, just candles and a radio, so there is some silver lining after all. Now, unfortunately for her, the situation in Crimea is about to get a lot worse. Recently, the commander of Ukrainian drone forces gave a rare public interview. In that interview, he summarized exactly what Ukrainian drones have done to Crimea and what they plan to do next. In short, he said things are not slowing down, they are only going to get worse. This is the guy running the Ukrainian drone program. He is deciding which Russian targets will be hit tomorrow. He is deciding what infrastructure will blow up next. He said, "We are making conditions unbearable for the invaders on the peninsula. We are closing off the access routes, the exit routes we are not touching. Let them get out if they want. Let all those millions drive across that bridge without stopping and go beyond the Urals and live in peace." This is what they have been settling here for over 10 years. It is their karma coming back to them. Let them go to Siberia and start from scratch if they are young enough. But we will not stop. Let them lose their logistics, their ammunition deliveries, their military gear, and the resources they use against us from Crimea. This is the first time in history we are doing this without a ground operation. We are creating conditions that make it impossible for them to stay without losing a single Ukrainian soldier. We are doing it all remotely using something called the freedom-loving Ukrainian bird. When we look at the map of where power has been restored, only one small area called Kerch has come back online because someone ran an extension cable. But we will handle that too in any scenario. I am telling you, we have already burned 21 tankers carrying fuel on the way in. We will burn another 72, then another 121, then another 221. We will burn as many as there are. It is just a matter of time. Now, this campaign is going to have far-reaching impacts. If you have been following this war since 2022, you know that whenever fuel prices go up, problems follow because inflation rises. Fuel is used for everything, so a food shortage is coming. Russia is already seeing signs of it. Prices are going up. Grain exports are going down. The impacts will ripple far beyond what Putin probably even thinks about. And guess what? We actually have big picture data from the Russian government itself. It tells us that the fuel crisis in Russia is hitting levels the country has not seen in decades. This is a report from Bloomberg which talks about Russian refining output dropping to a 21-year low. That means it is worse than it was during the COVID crisis in 2020, and it is worse than it was during the Great Financial Crisis in 2008. The Russian economy is experiencing something it has not experienced in a very long time, and the situation is only going to get worse as we move through the rest of 2026. Take a look at this chart. All the previous years are grouped together in a smooth range. Then we have 2026 in green, falling off faster than any other year, and I doubt Ukraine is going to slow down anytime soon. That means we can expect that line to drop even further. Now, there's a second data point that makes this even more strategically important. That has to do with Russian crude oil output. Here is the difference between refining and crude oil output. Refining is when Russia pumps oil out of the ground, sends it to its own refineries, and turns it into petroleum products for the domestic market. That is what Russian people buy at gas stations. Crude oil, on the other hand, is unrefined oil that Russia exports to other countries. They send it to refineries in China, India, and Turkey. Those countries refine it and either use it domestically or sell it to other nations. Because Russian refineries have been taking bombardment after bombardment from Ukrainian drones, refining output is plummeting, and because Russia cannot refine as much oil domestically, it is trying to export more crude instead. But other countries do not have enough demand to absorb all that excess supply. So Russian oil revenue is going down, and that revenue directly impacts the Russian budget, which in turn affects the war effort in Ukraine. There is an important caveat here. Russian crude oil output is falling, but not as fast as refining output. That means Russia is able to export some of its excess supply, but not all of it. My guess is that as the Ukrainian campaign continues, both numbers will keep going down. Now we also have to remember that Ukraine has expanded its campaign. They are no longer just going after refineries. Over the last 5 days, they have also started targeting Russian tankers. The data we just looked at is from May, so it is already a couple of months old. But in the last week alone, the campaign has expanded significantly. If Ukraine keeps targeting more and more tankers and other ways Russia ships out its oil, we can expect Russian oil output to slow down even further. They will not have enough refineries to process what they pump, and they will struggle to ship out what remains. That means Russia will be forced to slow down its own oil fields. This is a massive deal considering the Kremlin is already running a massive deficit because of the war, and it looks like the situation is only going to get worse. That is why the Kremlin spokesperson did something you probably did not expect. Dmitry Peskov publicly confirmed this week that Russia has asked the White House to intervene. Specifically, Russia has asked the United States to tell Ukraine to stop attacking Russian oil infrastructure and refineries. I am guessing the war is not exactly going how they planned because I doubt they wanted the United States to intervene on Russia's behalf. Now it is not just the Kremlin that is worried. There is a Russian television program where experts update the public on how the war is going. The recent episode was so gloomy and negative that the host actually asked the economic expert, "Do you have anything positive to say about the economy?" And the answer was not something he expected. The expert said, "Someday this will end." That was the optimistic message. Everything eventually passes. If you laughed at that, you are not alone. This actually reminds me of a story my parents used to tell me. I do not know if it is an Indian story or a Gujarati story, which is a subculture in India. The story goes like this. A king asked his wisest advisor to write down a single message on a piece of paper. The rule for this message was that it must make the king happy when he is sad and make him sad when he is happy. Something universal enough to work in both situations. The advisor thought for a long time and then wrote down 4 words. "This too shall pass." Well, that is basically what some Russian propagandists are feeling right now. They are going through it and they are really hoping this will pass very soon. Unfortunately, not everyone agrees with that kind of patience. In fact, some people are openly talking about revolution. More specifically, a revolution coming from the Russian youth who are not happy with how the economy is being run, how the country is being run, and they are especially not happy about the fact that all these old people are running the country. That could be a criticism applied to many places, but Russians are voicing it very loudly. Russian prosecutors are now criminally charging Russian citizens for sending Telegram stars to Ukrainian channels. Let me explain what this means. Telegram stars are in-app currency for Telegram, which is a messaging platform. A lot of people use Telegram to get updates on what is happening on the front lines. I follow some of these Telegram channels that are connected to the army on both sides. There are Ukrainian channels and Russian channels. Russian citizens do the same thing. They follow Russian channels and they also follow Ukrainian channels. Well, some of these citizens have actually sent stars, meaning they paid money to react to news on Ukrainian channels, and Putin is not very happy about that fact. These citizens are now being charged with treason inside Russia. Some of you may be wondering, is Telegram not banned in Russia? Well, guess what? It is banned. But you can use a VPN to open it. However, the cases we are talking about, and there have been multiple cases like these, refer to instances that happened in 2024 and 2025. So Russian prosecutors are going through history and charging people just for reacting to a message on a messaging app. And then we have Kremlin spokesperson Peskov himself changing his tune about the war. He is now officially calling it a war, not just a special military operation. He was recently asked why he changed the terminology he is using. His answer might surprise you. He said having Russia on one side and having the Kiev regime plus a number of European countries plus the United States supplying millions of tons of weapons to Ukraine, what it is not an operation anymore. It is war. It is a full-scale war. Now, I do not drink as much as Peskov, I am guessing, but I have not seen a NATO casualty inside of Ukraine yet in almost 5 years of this war. But I have seen North Korean casualties. I have seen Iranian missiles. I have seen Chinese drones that Russians are using. So is it really just Russia and its allies versus Ukraine and its allies? For some reason, now that Ukraine is hitting back, Russia seems to think this whole situation is unfair, forgetting that it was Putin who started this special military operation. This all brings us to something that most Western coverage is going to completely miss. That has to do with the food crisis, which is usually stage 2 of any fuel crisis. Whenever you have oil price problems, that usually bleeds into everything else in human life. People often overlook just how important diesel really is. Most people think of trucks or cars, but diesel is the lifeblood of agriculture. It is also critical for the military, though that is a story for another day. Today, let's focus on farming. Almost everything a modern farmer does depends on diesel: tractors, harvesters, combines, grain transport, irrigation equipment. Without fuel, none of it moves. And right now, Russian farmers are sounding the alarm. Russia is in the middle of harvesting season. They have only a short window before winter arrives. In roughly 2 months, maybe even sooner, the fields will begin freezing. Every day counts. But many farmers say they simply cannot afford to harvest. With diesel prices continuing to climb, they believe there will be no profit left by the time the crops are collected. One farmer summed it up bluntly: "If diesel reaches 100 rubles per liter, we won't even start our combines. We'll leave the crops in the fields." Think about that for a moment. Food ready to be harvested, simply left to rot because the fuel needed to collect it costs more than the harvest itself. A livestock farmer described the problem even more clearly. He explained that if grain farmers are forced to pay these fuel prices, they will naturally charge more for their grain. But meat and dairy farmers cannot simply raise their own prices because consumers are already struggling to afford basic food. So what happens? He reduces his herd. Instead of expanding production, he keeps only enough animals to survive. At the same time, the grain farmer loses customers because livestock producers are buying less feed. He used to purchase 15 to 18 tons of grain. Now he expects to buy only 5. That leaves the grain farmer asking one simple question: why should I borrow money to buy expensive diesel if I cannot even sell the grain afterward? Instead of making a profit, he ends up drowning in debt. The farmer called it exactly what it feels like. This isn't government support, it's a noose around our necks. And this is not just one frustrated farmer. Across Russia, many are saying exactly the same thing. No fuel means no harvest. No harvest means less grain. Less grain means less feed for livestock. Less feed means less meat, less milk, less bread. It becomes a chain reaction that spreads through the entire food system. We've seen this before. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, fuel shortages quickly became much more than a transportation problem. They became a food security problem. Russia and Ukraine together have long been considered one of the world's most important grain-producing regions. Millions of people across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East rely on grain exports from both countries. When production falls or exports are disrupted, the consequences don't stay inside Russia or Ukraine. They ripple across the globe. Food becomes more expensive, supplies become tighter, and countries already struggling with inflation feel the pressure first. Now those warning signs are beginning to appear again. Russian media reports that prices for vegetables, meat, and other food products have already started rising this week. If diesel shortages continue, analysts expect food inflation to accelerate even further over the coming weeks. Meanwhile, Ukraine's strategy has not changed. Kyiv continues to pressure Russia economically and militarily, arguing that the campaign will continue until Moscow agrees to negotiate a peace settlement based on conditions on the battlefield. But before we move on, something else caught my attention. The German embassy in Moscow published an unusually direct message aimed at the Russian public. As the Kremlin debates fuel rationing, emergency imports, and stronger air defenses, the embassy offered what it called a much simpler solution: end the war against Ukraine. Posting a message like that while operating inside Moscow certainly took courage. At the same time, Ukrainian long-range strikes against Russian infrastructure have continued almost every night over the past several days. My friend, let's stop here for now. In the next video, I will explain why Russian citizens are demanding for Putin's head and what Putin is saying to the Russian citizens about the high price of fuel. But till then, if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, Do well by hitting that subscribe button. By doing so, you encourage us to create more videos that explains what's going on around the world. Thank you. Your support means a lot to us.